I liked it. Of course, I'm detached.
Yes.
Sufficiently detached now because it's
It's not
so.
like looking to a perfect stranger to you.
Yeah.
In 1927, a 50-page divorce complaint filed by a teenage girl nearly destroyed the most famous man in the world. The girl's name was Lita Gray. She was 19 years old. She had been married to Charlie Chaplin for 2 years. She had met him when she was 12. He had cast her in a film when she was 13. He had begun a sexual relationship with her when she was 15. He had married her, in Mexico, in a rushed ceremony, when she was 16, and pregnant with his child, because the alternative was a statutory rape charge that would have put him in prison. The divorce complaint she filed in January of 1927 accused Charlie Chaplin of seduction of a minor, statutory rape, adultery, and soliciting an illegal abortion when she first became pregnant. It also accused him, in the careful legal language of the era, of demanding sexual acts so degrading that California law made them criminal. Acts, he told her, he had performed with 5 other prominent women of the motion picture industry. The complaint was 50 pages long. It leaked to the press. It was reprinted, in full, in newspapers across the country. It was read, by one estimate, by more Americans than had read any legal document in history. Theaters that showed Chaplin's films were picketed. Women's groups demanded his pictures be banned. The state of Georgia considered legislation to prohibit his films from being shown. Chaplin, who was in the middle of making The Circus, suffered a nervous breakdown so severe that production stopped for months. His hair, according to people who saw him during that period, turned white. The settlement cost him $825,000 in 1927 money. It was the largest divorce settlement in California history to that point. That was wife number 2. Wife number 1 had also been 16 when he married her. His name was Charlie Chaplin. He was the most famous entertainer on the planet. He was the creator of The Little Tramp, the character that had made the whole world laugh, the man who had turned pantomime into art and silent film into poetry. He was also, by the documented, uncontested record of his own life, a man who pursued teenage girls with a consistency that went beyond coincidence and into pattern. Of the 4 women he married, 3 were teenagers. Mildred Harris was 16. Lita Gray was 16. Oona O'Neill was 18. The 4th, Paulette Goddard, was in her mid-20s, which made her, by Chaplin's standards, practically elderly. His first love, a dancer named Hetti Kelly, was 15 when he fell for her. He was 19 at the time. He said, for the rest of his life, that she was the great lost love of his youth. Every teenage girl who came after her was, in some way he never fully examined, a replacement for the one who got away at 15. This is the story of Charlie Chaplin's 4 marriages, the teenage brides who paid the price for his fame, the divorce that nearly ended him, and the question that runs underneath the whole extraordinary, disturbing life: how the most beloved entertainer of the 20th century spent 50 years pursuing girls who were not old enough to understand what they were agreeing to, and how the world, for most of that time, simply let him. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The boy who became the most famous entertainer on earth grew up in a London slum so poor that his mother went insane from the stress of trying to keep him alive. Charles Spencer Chaplin was born on April 16, 1889, in Walworth, in the borough of Southwark, South London. His parents were both music hall performers, which sounds romantic until you understand what that meant in practice. His father, Charles Chaplin Sr., was a singer and comedian of middling talent and serious alcoholism, who left the family when Charlie was 3 and drank himself to death by 37. His mother, Hannah, was a singer and actress whose stage name was Lily Harley, and she had a voice, by the accounts of people who heard her, that was genuinely good. Good enough that she might have had a real career if poverty and mental illness had not taken it from her. Hannah tried to raise Charlie and his older half-brother Sidney alone in Kennington, in rooms that got smaller and cheaper as the money ran out. She took in sewing. She begged from neighbours. She performed when she could get bookings, which became less often as her voice began to fail and her mental state began to deteriorate. Charlie's first performance, the one he described for the rest of his life as the moment he understood what he was, happened when he was 5 years old. His mother was on stage at a music hall, singing, and her voice cracked and gave out in front of the audience. The crowd began to jeer. The stage manager, in desperation, pushed the 5-year-old boy out in front of them. Charlie started singing a popular song of the day. The audience laughed. Someone threw a coin. More coins followed. He kept singing. He picked up the money and kept going. His mother was taken off the stage and never really came back. By 1896, when Charlie was 7, Hannah's mental health had collapsed entirely. She was committed to Cane Hill Asylum, a psychiatric institution in Coulsdon, south of London. The diagnosis, as far as it was understood at the time, was a combination of psychosis, malnutrition, and what was likely syphilis, contracted from Charlie's father or another partner, which in its late stages attacks the brain. She would spend long stretches of the rest of her life in and out of institutions. Charlie would visit her. He would bring her things. And he would carry, for the rest of his life, the image of a beautiful, talented woman, destroyed by poverty and men and illness, a woman who had been young once and who had lost everything. Every biographer who has studied Chaplin's lifelong pursuit of very young women has pointed back to Hannah, not as an excuse, as an origin. The pattern, they argue, was a man who fell in love, over and over, with the youngest possible version of a woman, the version that still looked the way his mother had looked before the world broke her. He was chasing the girl Hannah had been at 16 or 17, the singer with the beautiful voice, before the poverty and the madness and the asylum. He was trying to get there before the damage arrived. With Hannah in the asylum and his father gone, Charlie and Sidney were sent to the Lambeth workhouse, the place where London housed its destitute. He was 7. The workhouse separated him from his brother. He wore a uniform. He slept in a dormitory. He was, at 7 years old, a ward of the state, fed and housed at public expense, because neither of his parents could keep him. He was moved from the workhouse to the Hanwell School for Orphans and Destitute Children, despite not technically being an orphan. He spent nearly 2 years there. When Hannah was briefly released from the asylum, the boys came home. When she relapsed, they went back. The cycle repeated through Charlie's childhood, a pendulum swinging between his mother's unstable care and the state's indifferent custody. By the time he was 10, he was working. He joined a clog dancing troupe called the 8 Lancashire Lads. By 14, he was doing small comedy and drama parts on the London stage. By 19, he had joined Fred Karno's comedy troupe, one of the most successful variety companies in England, and it was with Karno that he toured to America in 1910 and again in 1912. On the second American tour, he was spotted by Mack Sennett, the head of Keystone Studios, the biggest comedy factory in early Hollywood. Sennett signed him, and within a year of arriving in Los Angeles, Charlie Chaplin created the character that would make him the most famous human being on the planet. The little tramp, the bowler hat, the cane, the too tight jacket, the too big shoes, the moustache, the waddle. A character so simple that a child could recognize it, and so deep that film scholars are still writing about it a century later. By 1915, Chaplin was the biggest star in the world. By 1917, he had signed a $1 million contract, the first in the history of the film industry. By 1919, he had co-founded United Artists with Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith. He was 30 years old. He had come from a workhouse. He had watched his mother lose her mind. He had been given away by the state and raised by strangers. And now he was richer and more famous than any entertainer in the history of the world, with no one above him, no one to check him, and a pattern already forming in his private life that would follow him for the next 4 decades. He had fallen in love, at 19, with a 15-year-old dancer named Hetti Kelly. He described her as his first love. She died young, of influenza, in 1918, and Chaplin kept her memory for the rest of his life as the image of a perfect girl, frozen at 15, never allowed to age. Every wife who came after was, in some sense, a replacement for Hetti Kelly, and the first one arrived in 1918, the same year Hetti died. She was 16 years old, and she thought she was pregnant. The speed of Charlie Chaplin's rise was almost impossible to comprehend. One year, he was a young English comedian trying to understand the strange new business of moving pictures. The next, crowds were gathering outside theaters simply because his name appeared on the poster. Hollywood was still finding its identity. Feature films were in their infancy. Studios were learning the rules as they invented them. And in the middle of that uncertainty stood a small man in oversized shoes who somehow understood something no one else did. He knew that comedy worked best when it carried a hint of sadness. The character audiences came to know as the little tramp wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He was poor but proud, hungry but generous, lonely yet endlessly hopeful. He walked through a world that dismissed him, cheated him, and laughed at him, but he never surrendered his dignity. Perhaps that was why millions recognized themselves in him. Chaplin rarely explained the character in simple terms. He once suggested that the tramp was many contradictions at once, a gentleman and a vagabond, a dreamer and a survivor. Film historians have often pointed out that those contradictions reflected Chaplin's own childhood. Having experienced extreme poverty, institutional care, and public humiliation, he understood how fragile dignity could be. What he placed on screen wasn't merely slapstick. It was resilience. His popularity expanded at a pace that no entertainer had experienced before. By the middle of the 1910s, newspapers across Europe, North America, South America, Asia, and Australia carried stories about him. Toy companies sold Chaplin dolls, children copied his walk, men bought bowler hats and bamboo canes. Costume contests rewarded the best imitation of the little tramp. Long before television or the internet, Charlie Chaplin had become a global phenomenon. His earning power reflected that fame. Each new contract shattered the one before it. Studio executives who had once doubted him now competed for his signature. Salaries that seemed unbelievable only months earlier suddenly appeared modest compared to what Chaplin demanded next. Money, however, was never his greatest source of satisfaction. Freedom was. He disliked interference from producers. He disliked deadlines. Most of all, he disliked being told how his films should end. As his influence grew, so did his determination to control every stage of production. He wrote stories, directed scenes, performed the lead role, supervised editing, and eventually composed music for re-releases of his silent films. It was an extraordinary concentration of creative authority. Few filmmakers before him had attempted it. Fewer still succeeded. In 1919, Chaplin joined three of the most influential figures in American cinema: Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and director D. W. Griffith, to establish United Artists. The decision changed Hollywood forever. Rather than allowing major studios to own and distribute everything they created, the four partners built a company designed to give artists greater control over their own work. It was a bold challenge to the existing system, and it demonstrated just how much power Chaplin now possessed. The boy who had once slept in a workhouse dormitory had become one of the men reshaping the entire film industry. Yet extraordinary public success often concealed profound private uncertainty. Those closest to Chaplin frequently described a man who could be charming one moment and emotionally distant the next. He formed intense attachments, but struggled to sustain lasting relationships. Work consumed him. Perfection consumed him even more. A single scene might require dozens of rehearsals before cameras even rolled. Once filming began, dozens more takes were possible. If the emotion felt wrong, Chaplin simply started again. Crew members learned not to question the process. They also learned that the process usually worked. His films earned enormous profits not simply because they were funny, but because audiences sensed genuine feeling beneath the comedy. Laughter arrived first, compassion followed. That emotional balance became Chaplin's signature. Even as his career soared, one memory remained surprisingly vivid. Her name was Hetti Kelly. Years earlier, before worldwide fame, before Hollywood, before fortunes measured in millions, Chaplin had fallen deeply in love with a young dancer in London. They had known one another only briefly. Their romance barely had time to begin before misunderstandings and circumstances drove them apart. He was 19, she was 15. By every account, the relationship was innocent and remarkably short, yet its emotional impact proved lasting. Friends recalled that Chaplin spoke about Hetti for decades. In his autobiography, he described her as his first real love, someone whose memory never completely faded. Then came devastating news. In 1918, during the influenza pandemic that claimed millions of lives around the world, Hetti Kelly died while still in her 20s. Chaplin learned of her death after the fact. The possibility of reconciliation vanished forever. Biographers have often regarded Hetti as an important emotional figure in Chaplin's life, not because of the length of their relationship, but because it remained forever unfinished. Unlike later romances that became complicated by marriage, children, or public scandal, Hetti existed only as a memory, untouched by disappointment. Memory has a peculiar habit. It rarely grows older. While Chaplin's career continued to evolve, the image of his first love remained permanently frozen in youth. Whether that influenced his later relationships has become one of the most debated questions in Chaplin scholarship. Some historians believe it contributed to a lifelong pattern in his romantic choices. Others argue that reducing a complicated life to a single explanation oversimplifies both the man and the evidence. What is beyond dispute is the pattern itself. As the years passed, the women Chaplin pursued were consistently much younger than he was. That pattern became impossible to ignore in 1918. Hollywood introduced him to another teenage performer. Her name was Mildred Harris. She had begun acting as a child and was already familiar to movie audiences despite being only 16 years old. Bright, ambitious, and eager to establish herself, she moved comfortably through the growing world of silent film celebrities. Chaplin, now approaching 30, found himself captivated. Their relationship developed quickly, and almost as suddenly, an unexpected announcement changed everything. Mildred believed she was pregnant. In the social climate of the late 1910s, particularly for public figures, there appeared to be only one respectable solution: marriage. The wedding took place quietly in October 1918. For newspapers, it was another glamorous Hollywood romance. Behind closed doors, reality proved considerably more complicated. Medical examinations soon suggested that the original pregnancy had been a mistake. The marriage, however, could not be undone so easily. Two people who barely knew one another now found themselves trying to build a life under the relentless attention of the world's press. It was an uneasy beginning to what would become Chaplin's first marriage. And it marked the opening chapter of a private life that, over the coming decades, would become almost as famous and as controversial as the films that made him a legend. In public, Charlie Chaplin remained the little tramp, optimistic, kind-hearted, and endlessly resilient. In private, the story was becoming far more complicated. The marriage began under pressure. Before Charlie Chaplin and Mildred Harris had truly learned who the other was, they were husband and wife, living under the constant gaze of newspapers that treated every Hollywood romance as front-page entertainment. The pregnancy that had prompted their wedding proved to be a false alarm. But months later, Mildred really was expecting. For a brief moment, Chaplin believed he might finally build something he had never possessed himself: a stable family. It was a dream rooted deep in his childhood. He had grown up watching his own family disintegrate. His father had disappeared into alcoholism. His mother had slipped in and out of psychiatric hospitals. Home had never been permanent. Love had never felt secure. Now, standing at the peak of worldwide fame, he imagined creating the one thing money had never been able to buy him. Then tragedy struck. On July 7, 1919, Mildred gave birth to a baby boy, Norman Spencer Chaplin. The child was born with severe physical abnormalities. He survived only 3 days. No camera recorded Chaplin's reaction. No interview captured what he felt. Friends later remembered that he rarely spoke about the loss, burying himself in work almost immediately. Whether that silence reflected emotional restraint, denial, or overwhelming grief is impossible to know. Chaplin himself left few detailed accounts of those days. What is clear is that something changed. His studio became more than a workplace. It became an escape. For Chaplin, filmmaking had always demanded complete concentration. Now it offered something else. It gave him control. Life had taken away another person he loved. On a movie set, nothing happened by accident. Every movement could be repeated. Every mistake could be corrected. Every emotion could be refined until it matched the image in his mind. That pursuit of perfection would soon define both his greatest masterpieces and his most exhausting working habits. Crew members learned that working for Chaplin required extraordinary patience. If a joke wasn't funny enough, he rewrote it. If a scene wasn't emotional enough, he filmed it again. Sometimes dozens of times. Sometimes hundreds. Entire weeks of production could be discarded because he believed audiences deserved something better. It frustrated producers. It exhausted actors. But when audiences finally saw the finished films, they understood why he refused to compromise. In 1921, Chaplin released what many historians consider his first true masterpiece. The Kid. The story followed the little tramp unexpectedly becoming the guardian of an abandoned child. Together, the pair survived poverty with equal parts humor and heartbreak. The child was played by 6-year-old Jackie Coogan. Their chemistry was extraordinary. Audiences laughed at their schemes. Then, without warning, they cried. The emotional center of the film arrived when government officials attempted to separate the tramp from the boy. The desperate chase that followed remains one of the most moving sequences in silent cinema. For many viewers, it felt intensely personal. For Chaplin, it almost certainly was. He knew what it meant for children to be taken away. He knew what workhouses looked like. He remembered the loneliness of institutional care. Rather than simply inventing those emotions, he drew upon memories he had carried since childhood. The result was a film unlike anything comedy audiences had experienced before. It proved that laughter and heartbreak did not compete with one another. They strengthened one another. While The Kid elevated Chaplin's artistic reputation, his personal life continued to unravel. His marriage to Mildred Harris had become increasingly unhappy. Long hours at the studio kept them apart. Arguments became more frequent. Both later blamed the other for the relationship's collapse. In 1920, the marriage officially ended. The divorce attracted enormous media attention, but compared with what would happen a few years later, it was merely a preview. Because while Chaplin's career continued climbing higher than ever, another relationship was quietly beginning. Her name was Lita Gray. She had first appeared around Chaplin's productions as a young teenager. Several years later, after she had grown older, the two entered a romantic relationship. In 1924, everything changed again. Lita became pregnant. She was 16 years old. Chaplin was 35. The consequences were immediate. California law and public morality left little room for scandal involving Hollywood's biggest celebrity. Marriage followed quickly. Unlike the carefully managed public announcements surrounding Chaplin's films, this wedding was conducted with urgency and secrecy. Behind the scenes, friends sensed growing anxiety. Chaplin feared public disgrace. Lita found herself thrust into a marriage with one of the most famous men alive before she had reached adulthood. The pressures proved immense. Over the next several years, they welcomed two sons, Charles Chaplin Jr. and Sidney Chaplin. Fatherhood, however, did not heal the marriage. Chaplin's perfectionism, which created brilliance on screen, often became difficult to live with at home. His attention remained fixed on filmmaking. He disappeared into productions for months. His expectations of everyone around him were extraordinarily high, including himself. Meanwhile, Hollywood itself was changing. Studios were expanding. Movie stars were becoming international celebrities. Every disagreement inside famous marriages risked becoming tomorrow's headline. By 1927, the relationship had collapsed completely. The divorce that followed became one of the biggest celebrity scandals of the decade. Court documents contained explosive accusations. Newspapers printed intimate details day after day. Readers across America followed every development. Many of the claims remain disputed by historians even today, and separating proven fact from sensational reporting is not always possible. But one fact is beyond question. The scandal severely damaged Chaplin's public image. For perhaps the first time since becoming famous, millions of people were discussing Charlie Chaplin not because of a film, but because of his private life. The divorce settlement itself was staggering. Nearly $1 million. At the time, it ranked among the largest divorce settlements ever awarded in the United States. Financially, Chaplin could absorb the loss. Emotionally, the damage was harder to measure. He had become wealthier than he had ever imagined as a hungry child in South London. He had earned worldwide admiration. He had transformed comedy into an art form. Yet the stability he had searched for since childhood remained painfully out of reach. As one chapter of his personal life ended in scandal, another chapter of his career was preparing to make history once again. The world was about to see what many critics would later call the greatest silent comedy ever made. The Gold Rush. Scandal could fill newspapers. It could dominate conversations. It could tarnish reputations. But it could not diminish Charlie Chaplin's determination to make films exactly as he imagined them. If anything, personal turmoil seemed to sharpen his creative instincts. While his private life unraveled in courtrooms and newspaper columns, he poured his energy into a project that had lived in his imagination for years. It began with a single photograph. Chaplin had seen images from the Klondike gold rush of the late 19th century. Thousands of fortune seekers struggled across frozen mountain passes, carrying everything they owned on their backs. Many reached the Yukon, only to discover that wealth was far harder to find than they had imagined. To most people, those photographs represented hardship. To Chaplin, they represented possibility. What, he wondered, would happen if the little tramp were dropped into one of the harshest environments on Earth? That simple question became The Gold Rush. Released in 1925, the film combined breathtaking comedy with genuine desperation. The tramp wasn't simply chasing riches. He was fighting hunger, loneliness, freezing temperatures, and the crushing hope that tomorrow might finally bring a better life. Audiences laughed as Chaplin boiled and ate his own boot during a blizzard, carefully twirling shoelaces like spaghetti and chewing leather soles as though they were a gourmet meal. The sequence became one of the most famous scenes in cinema history. But beneath the comedy lay a memory Chaplin understood intimately: real hunger. As a child in South London, he had known what it meant to go to bed without enough food. He had watched his mother struggle to feed two boys with almost nothing. Poverty was not something he researched. It was something he remembered. That authenticity gave the film unusual emotional weight. Viewers laughed because the situations were absurd. They cared because the emotions were real. The Gold Rush became another international triumph. Years later, Chaplin would say that if he wished to be remembered for one film, this was the one. his confidence as a filmmaker continued to grow. Unlike most directors, he refused to separate comedy from emotion. Every joke needed a human reason to exist. Every laugh had to reveal something about the character. That philosophy transformed silent comedy from simple entertainment into storytelling with remarkable depth. Yet while Chaplin perfected silent cinema, a revolution was approaching. In 1927, Warner Brothers released The Jazz Singer. It wasn't the first motion picture to experiment with synchronized sound, but it became the first major commercial success to convince Hollywood that audiences wanted talking pictures. The industry changed almost overnight. Studios invested millions in new technology. Actors who had built careers through expressive movement suddenly worried about their voices. Directors abandoned silent techniques. Within only a few years, the era that had created Charlie Chaplin appeared to be ending. Many observers assumed his career would end with it. To them, silence belonged to the past. Chaplin disagreed. He believed cinema was an international language. A smile required no translation. Neither did grief, nor hope, nor loneliness. The Little Tramp could be understood by audiences in New York, Paris, Tokyo, Buenos Aires, or Cairo without speaking a single word. Why sacrifice that universality? Rather than joining Hollywood's rush toward dialogue, Chaplin made a decision that many considered commercial suicide. He would continue making silent films. Friends warned him. Executives questioned his judgment. Critics wondered whether he had become trapped in another era. Chaplin listened politely, then ignored them all. For nearly 3 years he worked on what became City Lights. The story was deceptively simple. The little tramp falls in love with a blind flower seller who mistakes him for a wealthy gentleman. Determined to help her regain her eyesight, he embarks on a series of increasingly desperate adventures. Like many Chaplin films, its emotional power came not from complicated plotting, but from profound human longing, hope, kindness, sacrifice, love offered without expectation. Chaplin obsessed over every detail. The brief scene in which the blind girl first mistakes the tramp for a millionaire reportedly required hundreds of takes before he found exactly the emotional rhythm he wanted. Crew members grew frustrated. Production costs climbed. Chaplin remained unmoved. If the audience didn't believe that single misunderstanding, the entire film would fail. When City Lights premiered in 1931, Hollywood had already embraced talking pictures. Chaplin's film contained almost no spoken dialogue. Many predicted disaster. Instead, audiences were captivated. Even Albert Einstein attended the Los Angeles premiere. The ending left theaters in complete silence. After the flower seller finally regains her sight, she discovers that the mysterious benefactor she had imagined as a wealthy gentleman is, in fact, the poor tramp standing before her in worn clothes and battered shoes. She gently takes his hand. For a moment, neither of them speaks. She smiles with recognition. "So, you can see now?" The question appears in an intertitle. "Yes," she silently answers. "I can see now." Film historians have repeatedly ranked the closing moments of City Lights among the greatest endings ever filmed. It required almost no dialogue, only expression, only humanity, only trust that audiences could understand emotion without words. Chaplin had won his gamble. Once again. But the world outside movie theaters was changing rapidly. The Great Depression had left millions unemployed. Factories expanded while workers feared becoming machines themselves. Economic anxiety spread across continents. Chaplin watched these changes carefully. The next story he chose would not simply entertain audiences. It would ask uncomfortable questions about the modern world. Questions that would ultimately make him one of the most controversial artists in America. The Little Tramp was about to enter the machine age. and Charlie Chaplin was about to make the last great silent film of his career. Modern times. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. When? Modern times. Premiered in 1936, audiences recognized something immediately. The little tramp was changing. So was the world. The film followed Chaplin's familiar wanderer as he struggled to survive in an industrial society that demanded speed, efficiency, and absolute obedience. One unforgettable sequence showed him tightening bolts on a factory assembly line until the rhythm consumed him completely. Another featured an experimental feeding machine designed to eliminate lunch breaks, treating workers less like people than parts of a larger machine. The comedy was brilliant. The message was unmistakable. Chaplin believed modern society was moving faster than humanity could keep pace. Millions of viewers, still living through the Great Depression, understood exactly what he meant. The film became another commercial success. It also marked the end of an era. Near the conclusion, the little tramp walks down a lonely road with the gamin, played by Paulette Goddard. They have no money, no certainty, no destination, only hope. The tramp smiles. They walk toward the horizon together. It was the last time audiences would ever see Charlie Chaplin's most beloved character. After more than 2 decades, one of cinema's greatest creations quietly disappeared. Behind the camera, another relationship was taking shape. Paulette Goddard had entered Chaplin's life several years earlier. Intelligent, ambitious, and fiercely independent, she was unlike many of the women he had previously dated. Rumors spread that the two had secretly married, although both remained deliberately vague about their legal status for years. Together, they appeared glamorous, sophisticated, and successful. For a while, it seemed Chaplin had finally found stability. But appearances can be deceptive. As Europe drifted toward another catastrophic war, Chaplin became increasingly concerned about politics. He watched Adolf Hitler rise to power in Germany. Like millions of others, he noticed something strangely ironic. The two men shared one unmistakable physical feature: the small toothbrush moustache. Chaplin later admitted that if he had fully understood the scale of the crimes the Nazi regime would commit, he might never have used the resemblance for comedy. But in the late 1930s, much of the world still underestimated Hitler's ambitions. Chaplin decided to confront dictatorship in the only language he knew best: cinema. The result was The Great Dictator. Released in October 1940, more than a year before the United States entered World War II, it became Chaplin's first true talking picture. He played 2 roles. One was Adenoid Hinkle, a ruthless dictator unmistakably modeled on Hitler. The other was a humble Jewish barber whose kindness stood in direct contrast to tyranny. For audiences accustomed to seeing Chaplin remain almost silent, hearing his voice throughout an entire feature film was a remarkable experience. The film mocked fascism relentlessly. It ridiculed military parades. It exposed the vanity of dictators. It transformed fear into satire. Then, in its closing minutes, Chaplin did something he had never done before. He stepped beyond the character. Standing before the camera, he delivered an earnest appeal for compassion, democracy, and human dignity. It was not the little tramp speaking. It was Charlie Chaplin. Some viewers found the speech deeply moving. Others believed it was too political. Either way, no one forgot it. History would ultimately vindicate Chaplin's warning about fascism. But victory abroad did not protect him from growing suspicion at home. Throughout the 1940s, political tensions inside the United States intensified. The Second World War ended. Almost immediately, the Cold War began. Fear of communist influence spread through American politics. Public figures found themselves scrutinized, not only for what they had done, but for what they believed. Chaplin became an easy target. He had frequently criticized poverty. He supported humanitarian causes. He questioned extreme nationalism. Although he repeatedly denied being a communist, and no evidence established that he belonged to the Communist Party, critics increasingly portrayed him as politically dangerous. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, under Director J. Edgar Hoover, had maintained an interest in Chaplin for years. That interest now intensified. Investigators collected reports, reviewed speeches, monitored public statements, examined personal associations. The file grew thicker. At the same time, Chaplin's private life once again moved toward controversy. His relationship with Paulette Goddard quietly came to an end. Neither spoke publicly in great detail about the separation. Another chapter closed. Another began. In 1941, a young aspiring actress named Joan Barry entered Chaplin's world. Their relationship was brief and turbulent from the start. Barry struggled with serious personal difficulties, and after the romance ended, the situation became increasingly volatile. According to court records and contemporary reporting, she repeatedly appeared at Chaplin's home, creating disturbances that attracted police attention. Then came an allegation that threatened to destroy everything he had built. Joan Barry announced that she was pregnant. She claimed Charlie Chaplin was the father. The accusation dominated newspapers across America. The legal battle that followed became one of the most sensational celebrity cases of the decade. Scientists performed one of the most advanced blood group tests then available. The results indicated that Chaplin could not be the biological father. Today, DNA testing would likely have ended the matter, but DNA analysis did not yet exist. Under California law at the time, blood group evidence that excluded paternity was not always enough to resolve the case. The courtroom drama continued. Public opinion shifted sharply against Chaplin. Many Americans paid less attention to the scientific evidence than to the headlines surrounding his relationships with younger women. In 1944, a jury found Chaplin legally responsible for supporting the child, despite the blood test evidence excluding him as the biological father. Legal historians have often cited the case as an example of the limitations of paternity law before the DNA era. For Chaplin, however, the damage extended far beyond the courtroom. His reputation suffered enormously. The cheerful comedian who had once united audiences around the world was now one of the most controversial men in America. Many assumed his career would never recover. Few realized that, during this period of relentless public criticism, another person had quietly entered his life, someone who would remain beside him for the rest of his years. Her name was Oona O'Neill. She was 18 years old, the daughter of the celebrated playwright Eugene O'Neill, and before long she would become Mrs. Charlie Chaplin. Their marriage would shock the world. It would also become the longest and most stable relationship of his life. The headlines were merciless. For years, Charlie Chaplin had survived scandal after scandal, believing that another successful film would eventually shift the public's attention back to his work. This time, it didn't. The Joan Barry case had left deep scars on his reputation. Political suspicion was growing. Gossip columnists followed his every movement. To many Americans, Charlie Chaplin was no longer simply the lovable little tramp. He had become a deeply polarizing public figure. Then, in the middle of the storm, he met someone who would change the final chapter of his life. Her name was Oona O'Neill. She was 18 years old, the daughter of Nobel Prize-winning playwright Eugene O'Neill, one of America's greatest literary figures. Chaplin was 54. Their age difference immediately became the story. Newspapers questioned the relationship. Critics mocked it. Friends privately wondered whether it could possibly last. Yet almost everyone who knew the couple personally described something very different from the public narrative. Oona appeared calm where Chaplin was restless, patient where he was obsessive, steady where his life had often been chaotic. Only a few months after meeting, they married on June 16, 1943. For Oona, the decision came at a personal cost. Her father strongly disapproved of the marriage. Their relationship deteriorated, and the two would never fully reconcile. Oona rarely spoke publicly about that heartbreak. Instead, she devoted herself almost entirely to her husband and, eventually, to their growing family. Over the next 2 decades, they would have 8 children together. It became the largest family Chaplin had ever known. Ironically, the man whose childhood had been defined by abandonment now found himself surrounded by children, laughter, and a home that remained remarkably stable. Professionally, however, peace remained elusive. In 1947, Chaplin released Monsieur Verdoux. The film shocked audiences. Instead of portraying the lovable underdog, Chaplin played Henri Verdoux, a charming man who marries wealthy widows, murders them, and steals their money. The story was inspired in part by the real-life French serial killer Henri Désiré Landru, but Chaplin transformed it into something larger. It was a dark satire, a film that asked an unsettling question. If society celebrates mass killing during war, why is individual murder treated as uniquely monstrous? The comparison disturbed many viewers. Some critics praised its courage. Others condemned it as cynical and unpatriotic. By the late 1940s, America had entered a new political era. The Second World War was over. The Cold War had begun. Fear of communism spread rapidly through American institutions. Government employees were investigated. Actors were blacklisted. Writers lost careers. Political loyalty became a national obsession. Chaplin found himself under increasing scrutiny. Although he had never become an American citizen, despite living in the United States for decades, he had spoken openly about peace, humanitarian causes, and social inequality. To supporters, these positions reflected compassion. To opponents, they appeared suspicious. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had accumulated an extensive file on Chaplin over many years. Agents collected speeches, tracked interviews, reviewed reports from informants, examined his friendships. Despite years of investigation, no evidence established that Chaplin had been a member of the Communist Party. But suspicion alone proved politically powerful. By the early 1950s, much of the American public had turned against him. In 1952, Chaplin completed what he believed would be another major motion picture, Limelight. The film told the story of an aging comedian struggling to accept that his greatest days were behind him. Many saw it as deeply autobiographical. Its themes of fading fame, regret, and redemption felt intensely personal. Before the American premiere, Chaplin, Oona, and their children boarded the RMS Queen Elizabeth for a voyage to England. It was meant to be a temporary trip. While the ship crossed the Atlantic, unexpected news arrived. The United States government had revoked Chaplin's re-entry permit. If he wished to return, he would first need to appear before immigration authorities and answer questions regarding his political views and personal conduct. For Chaplin, the message was unmistakable. After more than 40 years in America, the country where he had become the world's greatest film star no longer wanted him. Rather than fight publicly for re-entry, Chaplin made a decision that surprised many observers. He simply stayed away. He settled with Oona and their children in Coursier-sur-Vevey, a quiet village overlooking Lake Geneva in Switzerland. The estate they purchased became known as Manoir de Banne. For the first time since childhood, Chaplin enjoyed something approaching ordinary family life. His children later described a father who could be playful, demanding, affectionate, and endlessly curious. He walked through the gardens, played music, worked on scripts, entertained guests from around the world. Away from Hollywood, the relentless pressure that had followed him for decades gradually faded. he continued making films. A King in New York, released in 1957, openly mocked McCarthyism, political paranoia, and the culture that had driven him from America. Years later came A Countess from Hong Kong, starring Marlon Brando and Sophia Loren. Released in 1967, it failed to match the artistic or commercial success of his earlier masterpieces. The era of silent comedy had long since passed. A new generation of filmmakers now dominated world cinema. Chaplin understood that history was moving forward. But history also has a way of reconsidering its judgments. As the years passed, many critics who had once dismissed him began to reassess both his films and the political controversies surrounding his exile. The angry headlines faded. The extraordinary body of work remained. Then, in 1972, something remarkable happened. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences invited Charlie Chaplin back to Hollywood. For the first time in 2 decades, he returned to the city that had made, and rejected, him. No one knew exactly how audiences would respond. Some expected polite applause. What happened instead became one of the most unforgettable moments in Academy Awards history. As Chaplin walked onto the stage, the audience rose to its feet. The applause continued, and continued. For 12 extraordinary minutes, actors, directors, writers, cinematographers, many of whom had grown up inspired by his work, stood together in tribute. An old man who had once arrived in America with almost nothing now stood before Hollywood as one of the founders of modern cinema. It was not a verdict on every decision he had ever made, nor did it erase the controversies that had followed him throughout his life, but it acknowledged something impossible to deny. Without Charlie Chaplin, the history of film would look profoundly different. His journey, however, was not quite over. One final chapter remained. It would ask the question that still divides historians today. How should the world remember Charlie Chaplin? As a genius? As a deeply flawed man? Or as both at the same time? History has a habit of simplifying people. It prefers heroes or villains. Charlie Chaplin refused to fit comfortably into either category. By the 1970s, the frantic pace of his life had slowed considerably. The endless film sets, courtroom battles, political attacks, and international headlines had given way to something he had almost never experienced as a child: peace. At Manoir de Ban, overlooking Lake Geneva in Switzerland, Chaplin spent his final years surrounded by Oona and their children. Visitors often found an elderly man who still possessed the unmistakable curiosity that had driven him since childhood. He continued writing ideas, listening to music, discussing films, and reflecting on a career that had changed cinema forever. Age, however, eventually demanded its price. His health gradually declined. Walking became more difficult. Public appearances became increasingly rare. Yet his influence only continued to grow. A new generation of filmmakers studied his work frame by frame. Directors admired the precision of his visual storytelling. Actors marveled at how much emotion he could communicate without speaking a single word. Film schools treated The Kid, Wow, City Lights, Modern Times, and Far, The Great Dictator, not simply as classics, but as lessons in the language of cinema itself. Recognition followed. In 1972, Hollywood welcomed him back after 2 decades of exile, awarding him an honorary Academy Award for the incalculable effect he has had in making motion pictures the art form of this century. The standing ovation lasted approximately 12 minutes. It remains one of the longest in Academy Awards history. For many watching, it felt like more than applause. It felt like reconciliation. 5 years later, another honor arrived. In 1975, Queen Elizabeth II knighted Charlie Chaplin, making him Sir Charles Chaplin. The boy who had once slept in London's workhouses, wearing institutional uniforms and wondering where his next meal would come from, had become one of the most celebrated artists the world had ever known. It was a remarkable journey, not because it was perfect, but because it seemed almost impossible. On Christmas Day, December 25, 1977, Charlie Chaplin died peacefully at his home in Switzerland. He was 88 years old. The world mourned. Tributes arrived from political leaders, actors, directors, writers, musicians, and ordinary people who had grown up laughing at the little tramp's awkward walk and gentle smile. For most public figures, the story would have ended there. For Charlie Chaplin, it did not. Just a few months after his funeral, something extraordinary happened. During the night, 2 men dug up Chaplin's coffin from the village cemetery. Their motive was not revenge. It was money. The thieves demanded a ransom from Oona Chaplin, believing that the family would pay to recover his remains. She refused. Calmly and firmly, she told investigators that her husband would have found the entire scheme ridiculous. Swiss police launched an extensive investigation. After weeks of surveillance and interviews, they located the buried coffin in a nearby cornfield. The men responsible were arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. Chaplin's body was reburied, this time beneath reinforced concrete to prevent another theft. Even in death, Charlie Chaplin remained the center of an unbelievable story. Perhaps that should not surprise us. His entire life had unfolded somewhere between comedy and tragedy. The same child who had experienced crushing poverty would eventually become one of the wealthiest entertainers on earth. The same performer who made millions laugh had carried memories of hunger, abandonment, and institutional care that never completely disappeared. The same filmmaker who championed compassion through The Little Tramp would spend decades defending himself against accusations, scandals, and political hostility. His legacy remains complicated. There is little debate about his artistic achievements. He transformed silent comedy into emotional storytelling. He proved that films without dialogue could move audiences across languages, cultures, and continents. He pioneered creative independence at a time when studios controlled almost everything. His influence can still be seen in filmmakers from every corner of the world. His personal life, however, continues to provoke difficult conversations. Several of his relationships involved significant age differences that remain controversial today. Historians continue to examine those choices, placing them within both the legal standards of his era and the ethical questions they raise today. Admiring Chaplin's artistic genius does not require ignoring those uncomfortable aspects of his life. The opposite is also true. Recognizing his personal flaws does not erase what he accomplished for cinema. History rarely offers us perfect people. It offers us human beings. Brilliant, contradictory, capable of extraordinary beauty and profound mistakes, sometimes within the very same life. Perhaps that is why Charlie Chaplin still fascinates us, nearly a century after The Little Tramp first appeared on screen. Not because he was flawless, not because he was innocent, but because his story reminds us that greatness and imperfection can exist in the same person. On screen, The Little Tramp always kept walking, no matter how many doors closed, no matter how many times the world knocked him down. Hat tilted, cane in hand, hope somehow intact. And maybe that is the image that has endured longer than any scandal. A lonely wanderer with oversized shoes and an unbreakable spirit, disappearing down an endless road toward a horizon he could never quite reach. The man eventually stopped walking. The character never did. More than a century after Charlie Chaplin first stepped before a motion picture camera, The Little Tramp is still making audiences laugh. And, just as importantly, reminding them to care. That is a legacy few artists ever achieve. And it is why Charlie Chaplin remains not just one of the greatest comedians in history, but one of the most influential storytellers the world has ever known. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.